Hello, I read 4 books in October and I wanted to talk about them. You know when you put off a book because you know it's gonna be so good and you are like, I want to save this for when I'm like emotionally ready to savor it? That was Everything is Tuberculosis for me. I was a typical like John King kid reading like all his fiction in 2016, that era, when I was like a preteen going on teens. So I had never read his nonfiction, like I haven't read The Anthropocene Reviewed, but I've been hearing really interesting things about Everything is TB, so I wanted to read that. I don't have a copy of it because I borrowed it from my friend who got me to read it because of all the facts they gave me. The Anthropocene Reviewed was a series of essays, and each essay was kind of focused on a different topic. I thought Everything is TB was going to be like that based on the facts they were giving me. I thought it was going to be a historical event, and then kind of tying in how that relates to tuberculosis to kind of show that it's like ever present and, you know, more of a health crisis than us in the Western world like typically think of it. But it was so much more than that. John Green is so good at writing a narrative that's just compelling, and the through line of this book is really his relationship with a kid named Henry that he meets at a tuberculosis hospital, and I think it's Sierra Leone. And he also like develops relationships with a doctor and another young person that struggles with kind of tuberculosis healthcare. But Henry is really the focal point of this story, and I thought that was just a really good like centering point, because it's really easy to read nonfiction about you know, disease or healthcare like as a system and really see that as like different facts, you know, and that could be like really abstract. But in centering the story throughout this book on like Henry and tying back to him and other people affected by the healthcare system and the lack of kind of money being put into tuberculosis treatment, that was really effective and honestly had me tearing up by the end. So I loved Everything is Tuberculosis much more than I thought I was going to. I thought I was going to like learn something and have some takeaways that I would want to share with people, but I was also like really emotionally connected to the story. But if I had to review the book in like one phrase, it would just be Everything is Capitalism, because it always comes down to that. So yeah, but obviously it's a lot more complex than that. The second book I read in October was Clytemnestra by Constanza Casati. And this book just a focus on Clytemnestra and her life. And if you didn't know, based on kind of the Trojan War, basically the leader of the Greeks is Agamemnon, and Agamemnon is Clytemnestra's husband. But I grew up, you know, Percy Jackson kid, reading a lot of Greek myths, kind of beyond Percy Jackson too, and I did not remember anything about Clytemnestra. So we read this for my book club. I purely just bought it like I think last December, from Browser Books in San Francisco, and then wanted to pick something for my TBR for the book club. You know, I had a phase, maybe like 2016, kind of at the height of Song of Achilles, where I was just obsessed with like Greek mythological retelling fiction. So this was the first time I'd picked up one of these in a long time since that phase. So yeah, I kind of finished this book and I was like, yeah, I like that. But then the more I thought about it, and especially after like the discussion in our book club, I think I didn't love it and I have some major problems with it. I'll give like a major spoiler, but basically there's a pretty traumatic event that happens pretty early on in Clytemnestra's life. She's still a teenager, and it's right after her marriage, that pretty much ruins like any depth that Clytemnestra and Agamemnon could have in their relationship. I think it would have been a lot more interesting for that like act to not have happened and then see kind of naturally where Agamemnon and Clytemnestra go. But really because of that, I feel like it kind of ruins the relationship that they can have and any nuance with that. because basically Clytemnestra just lives her life with rage and contempt. Just felt like that derailed the story, especially after finding out that creative choice from the author and not really like widely spread within myths. And you know, that may or may not be true. There's lots of different epics and poems and sources that can be used for Greek mythological retellings, but I did kind of have a problem with that. And I'm also reading another book called Electra by Jennifer Saint, and I feel like that actually leans into Clytemnestra as a much more nuanced and interesting character, because the major event that happens early on in this book doesn't occur in that. And really Clytemnestra makes up her own mind about who Agamemnon truly is and how she feels about the relationship. And I thought I was a lot more compelled by her character in that. And ironically, I picked up that book because I was more interested in Electra, even though she's a side character in this. And then Clytemnestra also features in that book, so yeah. The third book I read was Perfection by Vincenzo Latronico. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize this year, and is translated from Italian into English. It's really short. I think it was like 120 something pages. And honestly, I like the cover. I judge the book by the cover. I also wanted to read something Booker Prize shortlisted, but didn't want to commit to some of the like behemoths that are picked for that. So I was interested in the premise. Basically, it's two millennial expats, Anna and Tom, who live in Berlin. They're from undisclosed Eastern European country, but then they've settled into their kind of digital contractor nomad life in Berlin. And it starts off with them kind of just being described pretty generally. There's like an omnipresent kind of detached narration throughout the entire book. So you never really know what Anna and Tom are thinking kind of intimately, but more kind of abstractly what their worldview is and how they live life and what their like groups of friends are. But the book is a very like 2020s book. Like it describes kind of digital contracting and kind of influencers and kind of more current event focused things like elections and the refugee crisis. I say the refugee crisis as if it's like one thing, but kind of a refugee crisis in Germany, and also kind of what their friends think about and how their groups of friends change throughout their lives in Berlin. Not a whole lot happens in the book. There's kind of one major event where they like have a life change, and then it's an intentional life change that kind of gets them thinking about how they're living and how they want to live. But really the book follows these two people as just kind of millennial digital nomad expat archetypes. And I think that works really well in kind of being like a societal snapshot and also kind of cultural criticism. I didn't expect to love it as much as I did. I think it's also a book that I like immediately want to reread. Like I finished it and I was like, I want to read that again. I think I'll just like kind of discover more nuances and be like find different things funny the different time or the multiple times that I pick up the book. So I think like I already want to read it again. I want to share it with like every friend and see what they think, because everyone's gonna have their own takes. And it's definitely a book that I want to read, you know, like 10, 25 years down the line, and reflect back on this time in my life and history. I bought that book from Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I don't have it because I loaned it to a friend. Like I said, I really want people to tell me what they think. And the fourth book I read in October was They Call Us Exceptional and Other Lies That Raised Us by Prachi Gupta. I bought this at Brookline Booksmith in Allston, Massachusetts when I was visiting my friend in Boston. And it's a memoir. Basically, the premise is that Prachi is a high-achieving Indian American child of immigrants from India, and the book is basically like her retelling of growing up with a lot of like academic stress and pressure to succeed, but the book goes way beyond that. Honestly, I picked it up expecting to like relate to the kind of second gen immigrant experience again, as if that's like one thing, but I thought I would like relate to some aspects of that, and although I did, it goes a lot deeper. pretty much the through line is that Prachi kind of debunks the model minority myth, but also kind of relays her experiences and the aftershocks of emotional abuse in her household, kind of a patriarchal father who tampers his wife's kind of aspirations and opportunities by like trying to be, or kind of masking that in being like truthful to Indian culture, but really he's grown up in Canada and the US, so there's a lot of interesting dynamics with mental health and kind of mental health stigma, especially because Prachi was growing up, I think, kind of in the early 2000s, so it's definitely a different landscape than now. As well as Prachi deciding to pursue a career in writing and journalism rather than business or engineering and science, like she'd always been pressured to. So really that doesn't scratch the surface of what this book does. About kind of like halfway through, I was like, oh, this is good. I'm kind of thinking a lot about these different issues, and it's very complex, and I think she's taking us through them well. But then something happens pretty much halfway that just kind of destroyed me. A couple big life events in her family, and then from there I was really invested and engaged. And one thing I really found impressive from the author was that she's had to do like a lot of processing with several traumatic events that had been ingrained at her since childhood, you know, and working through that I'm sure has been really difficult and hard to parse through, especially because, you know, when you have, oftentimes I've heard like in response to traumatic events, people tend to like block them out and therefore have like memory holes. So to be able to kind of walk the reader through these events that happened to her and conversations she had, but kind of have the emotional depth from the perspective of her as a child and then like a teen, a young adult, etc. Being able to kind of portray that, communicate that was so impressive to me, and I really thought it was well done. I also really loved that the narration is kind of written as if a letter to her mom. Not necessarily like Dear Mom, but kind of like, this is what I think you might have thought, or this is what I wanted to tell you. And I thought that was very personal and made everything that happened feel very close to me as the reader. So it made everything even more impactful, even though the events of her life were insane and what she had to go through was crazy. So I thought this was really good. Favorite book out of the 4 that I reviewed today. And yeah, from there I'm going to try and finish a lecture by Jennifer Saint that I kind of set aside to read perfection. So yep. So yeah.